It is late on a quiet Wednesday night. The house is still, no footsteps, no voices calling out. The TV hums in the background more for company than entertainment. A man in his 50s sits with the silence. This could be someone you know, or it could be you. Gen X grew up learning to manage on their own. As kids, they often came home to empty houses and handled things without much check-in from adults. Decades later, many of those same men are again living in quiet spaces, relying on that same independence. Whether that independence is still serving them well is another matter. This is not about stereotypes of lonely bachelors, it is about understanding the psychology behind this lifestyle. How did he get here? What does his day-to-day experience actually feel like? Where does this way of living hold steady, and where does it begin to subtly break down? The statistics give some context. In the US, roughly 2/3 of single men in midlife live alone. In 1970, only about 7% of midlife adults had never married. By 2020, that number had risen to nearly 30%. About 1 in 3 men in this age group has never married. This is not a fringe situation, it reflects a broader societal change, with Gen X right at its core. But numbers don't capture the full picture. What matters more is the personal path that leads someone to this life, and what it feels like once they are there. Gen X had a unique upbringing. They were the original, latchkey kids, coming home to empty houses, preparing their own meals, and solving their own problems. Research from the early 2000s even described them as one of the least supervised generations in American history. Yet this lack of oversight had a complex effect. It often strengthened their independence, problem-solving ability, and comfort with solitude. Psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott once said that the ability to be alone is the most important sign of emotional maturity. In many ways, Gen X developed that capacity early, whether intentionally or not. So when a man in his 50s says he is comfortable living alone, he's not necessarily putting on a front. He is describing a skill he's practiced since childhood. Silence doesn't disturb him, it is familiar. However, this is where things become more complicated. When self-reliance is ingrained deeply enough, it can stop feeling like a learned ability and start feeling like a fixed identity. Over time, it becomes harder to tell whether you genuinely don't need others, or if you've simply become very good at convincing yourself that you don't. That distinction is more important than it seems. Not every man arrives at this life in the same way. From the outside, the situation may look identical, same quiet home, same solitary routines, but the inner experience can vary greatly depending on the journey. Some men simply never married. It wasn't a deliberate rejection of relationships or the result of a major heartbreak. Life just unfolded that way. In their 20s, they focused on building careers and creating stability. Relationships happened, sometimes lasting for years, but they never quite turned into lifelong commitments. And over time, living alone shapes everything. Daily routines, personal spaces, even small habits like how coffee is made, all become tailored to one person. Eventually, that level of personalization becomes so comfortable that the idea of adjusting it to accommodate someone else can feel less like an improvement and more like a disruption. When people ask him, "Don't you ever get bored?" he often looks confused rather than defensive, as if the question doesn't quite make sense. Bored of what? His life runs on its own internal momentum. What others call boredom is, for him, just normal. Then there's a different situation altogether, the man who was once married and is now on his own. Research on this group paints a much heavier picture. Unmarried men between 40 and 60 are about 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide than married men of the same age. For divorced men in particular, the rate is even more striking, around 8 times higher than that of divorced women. The explanation researchers point to isn't about personal weakness or flaws. It's more about how their lives were structured. Many men unknowingly built their entire social world around their marriage. Their partner often managed the connections, keeping friendships alive, remembering important dates, organizing gatherings, and maintaining social ties. When the marriage ends, it is not just the relationship that disappears. The entire support system that came with it can fall apart. Suddenly, he's not only living alone, he's socially isolated in a way he may not even know how to describe because he never had to create or maintain those networks himself. So you have got two men who appear almost identical from the outside, same age, similar homes, similar routines. But their experiences are very different. One has spent decades living alone and has refined every part of that lifestyle. The other finds himself there for the first time in his 50s, gradually realizing, often with difficulty, that independence is something you develop over time. It doesn't simply arrive when circumstances demand it. There is also a third group that rarely gets discussed: widowers. These are men who once had a full life and relationship, then lost it, not through separation, but through an unexpected absence they couldn't prepare for. Their experience of being alone is different. The home still reflects a shared life, two of everything, reminders everywhere. They are not starting from zero, they are trying to adjust to solitude in a space that used to carry a completely different meaning. Studies consistently show that widowed men face some of the highest levels of depression and isolation in midlife. The reason overlaps with what is seen in divorced men: the partner who maintained social ties is no longer there. Only now, there's no conflict to process, just loss. And that kind of emptiness carries its own weight. So what does a typical day actually look like for someone in this position? It is often not what people imagine. He tends to wake up early, not because of outside noise, but because that's when he feels most clear-headed. His routine is steady, even precise. Coffee is made the same way every morning, exactly to his preference. If he's still employed, he goes to work. If not, he finds something to engage with, a personal project, or hours spent diving into interests like old motorcycles or woodworking, without feeling the need to justify it. Meals happen on his own schedule. Dinner might be early or late, there is no fixed time but his own choice. There's a quiet kind of satisfaction in that independence that's hard to explain unless you've lived it. Evenings tend to fall into two patterns. In one, he fills the quiet with background noise, a game, a documentary, a podcast, not out of discomfort, but because he operates better with something playing. In the other, he leans into the silence. He reads, reflects, or simply sits and watches the world outside, completely comfortable with the stillness. In both cases, the underlying reality is the same: there's no one to check in with, no one depending on his schedule. For some men, that feels like freedom. For others, depending on the circumstances, it can slowly take on a different meaning. Here's where the research becomes especially revealing. A 2026 study on Gen X men and friendship found that 95% of them believe friendships are crucial for a happy, healthy life. So the issue isn't a lack of value, they clearly care. The gap lies between valuing connection and actually having the tools to sustain it. Compared to women, men in the study were less likely to volunteer, attend regular social gatherings, or join local groups. In fact, only about 1 in 5 men reported being part of any community organization. Researchers also described men's friendships as intense in shared interests but limited in emotional openness. Conversations can go on for hours about sports, politics, music, or current events, but rarely shift into something more personal, like admitting they have been struggling or feeling disconnected. It is not that those feelings are not there, it is that many men were never really taught how to express them. Over time, not asking for help or connection can even become part of how they see themselves. Men often bond through shared activities, working on projects, watching games, or spending time side by side. The interaction happens around the activity itself. But when a man in his mid-50s lives alone and his closest companion is far away, those connections can fade into occasional messages in a group chat that rarely gets attention. What makes this harder is that these friendships don't formally end. There's no argument or clear break, they just go inactive. Both people assume the bond is still there, like a tool sitting and used in a garage. But the longer it sits, the harder it feels to pick back up, as if it now requires a specific reason or moment. So nothing happens, and time quietly passes. About 60% of Gen X adults are classified as lonely, higher than the rate among baby boomers. Yet from the outside, many of these individuals seem perfectly fine. They have stable jobs, routines, homes, and responsibilities. The loneliness isn't obvious. It shows up as someone who's always occupied, always managing things, and rarely asks for anything. And if the topic comes up, he might quickly steer the conversation towards something safer, like a recent game. What often gets overlooked, though, is that long-term solo living in midlife isn't purely negative. There are real benefits, not as a way to soften the downsides, but as genuine positives. There's a deep sense of stability in a life built entirely on one's own terms. Every habit and routine is self-directed rather than negotiated. He eats what he prefers, sleeps on his own schedule, and spends money according to his priorities. And on certain days, like a calm Saturday afternoon, when everything feels in order, the weather is just right, and there are no obligations, his life feels exactly as he would choose it. In those moments, his sense of contentment is real, not something he's pretending to feel. Here's a surprising pattern in the data: loneliness doesn't keep rising with age, it actually declines. People in their late 40s and 50s report the highest levels, with nearly half saying they feel lonely during that period. But as they move into their 60s and 70s, those numbers steadily drop. A Gen X man who feels unsettled at 53 often experiences things differently by 65. Priorities change, self-acceptance grows, and the pressure of what life should have been starts to fade. That perspective can matter a lot if you're currently in the middle of that phase. That said, there's another risk in this kind of lifestyle that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's not loneliness in the usual sense. It's something quieter: drift. Drift happens when there's no external structure and no one reflecting your habits back to you. It doesn't hit all at once. It builds slowly, almost invisibly, in ways that feel normal while they're happening. One missed gym session turns into a week. Meals become more basic, then less intentional. Sleep patterns change slightly, then more significantly. And without anyone to point out the change, nothing feels off. You simply adjust to a new version of normal. A self-directed life can feel steady even as it gradually shrinks. There's no warning signal, no clear break, just a realization, at some point, that your world has quietly narrowed. Not because of a major event, but because nothing interrupted the process. This kind of pattern isn't abstract, it's something many people recognize in their own lives. You can think you're doing fine, only to notice later that your routine has slowly contracted: less activity, less variety, less outward energy. It doesn't happen in a single moment, it happens because nothing pushes against it. So what actually helps? Research points to practical, low-effort solutions rather than dramatic changes. One study highlighted a simple idea called Wednesday Waffle. A group of men agreed to record a short, 2-minute video each week, unscripted, no specific topic, and share it in a group chat. That was it. No scheduling or pressure, just a small, consistent check-in. And it worked, not because it was deep or complex, but because it was easy enough to sustain. The takeaway is clear: small, regular contact is more effective than occasional, high-effort interaction. A quick weekly message can matter more than a long call once or twice a year. Men who adapt well to living alone long-term usually don't try to overhaul their entire social world. Instead, they create a few simple anchors: one reliable connection, one routine that gets them out of the house, and one commitment they stick to regardless of mood, and they maintain those consistently. It also helps to link interaction to an activity. Rather than forcing deep conversations, it's more natural to show up for something shared, like meeting regularly for a task or hobby. The conversation happens along the way, as a byproduct rather than the main goal, which makes it easier to sustain. Above all, structure becomes essential. In a fully independent life, it replaces many of the external supports that would otherwise keep things on track. Fixed routines, set times, and habits that continue regardless of motivation help prevent drift. Because in a life without built-in accountability, motivation is often the least reliable factor. When structure stays intact, everything else tends to remain manageable. But once it starts to slip, other parts often follow, gradually at first, then in ways that seem obvious only in hindsight. So what does the full picture actually look like? He isn't damaged, stuck, or secretly unhappy behind a carefully managed routine. He's built a life that often works well for him. He's comfortable in his own company in a way many people aren't. His sense of drive comes from within, and for the most part, it sustains him. But there are quieter moments that don't fit that stability. Like sitting alone in a waiting room with no one to message. A holiday passing without a meaningful exchange. Or that brief moment at night when something stirs in the house and there's no one there to share the glance with. These moments don't erase the good ones, but they exist, and they matter. You see them reflected not just in research but in the experiences people quietly share. The real psychological tension lies in the space between being alone and feeling alone. After years of relying on himself, he can struggle to tell the difference. He's so used to not needing others that the absence of connection doesn't always register clearly. He might go nearly 2 weeks without a meaningful conversation, notice it in passing, and still label it as fine. Not out of denial, but because the system he's built doesn't flag it as a problem. The signal fades quietly, without setting off any alarm. Many men maintain friendships that span decades, connections formed in school or early work years. The bond doesn't disappear because they stop caring, it fades because they were never really shown how to keep it active. They tend to wait for a reason to reconnect. And sometimes, that reason never comes, until years have passed. If you're someone sitting in a quiet house on a typical evening, the answer isn't to suddenly reinvent your life or force yourself into something that doesn't fit. But reaching out to a friend you haven't spoken to in years, that's different. Not because something's wrong, and not because you need anything, just because too much time has gone by. Chances are, the person on the other end is living a similar routine, in a similar silence, also waiting for a reason that never quite arrives. Sometimes it only takes one small, easy action to reconnect. The connection isn't gone, it's just been left unused. Someone simply has to pick it back up.